Good morning, everybody. So the last music piece we have was Hallelujah. Maybe we get some help to get some good ideas and have an inspiring day today. So thank you for the short introduction. So my name is Roland Pawlitschko. I will moderate the first panel today. And first of all, I also want to say that that's a great honor for me to be here and to see you all here physically present and welcome you. So I think around 150 people are here in Attisholz, and another, I guess, 100 are watching online the event. So welcome you all. So I first want to introduce myself. So I'm an architect. And I'm a freelance editor, publisher, journalist. And since 15 years, I'm also a freelance journalist for Detail magazine, you might know. And one of the first things which, well, let grow my passion for engineering was a book in the Detail Engineering series about Schleich-Bergermann partner. So as we heard from Hugo Kerez, Jörg Schleich, I think he passed away really 2 weeks ago. And this was a really great work to do the concept for this book and to do the interviews with all the people. So this was a kind of starting point for my engineering passion. After this, so I'm also working for other magazines, architectural magazines, German and Austrian magazines. Writing texts, doing interviews, moderating events. And I also was like a co-responsible for Structure, a magazine published by Detail, which isn't published anymore, unfortunately, but we had this magazine for 5 years. And we had there very interesting texts from engineers and architects. So this was a magazine for both architects and engineering. So this is a very important connection, as we heard this morning, of course. For the panel, I want to say some words. So we have we have 4 people, which I will introduce in 1 minute. They all have 5 minutes for a lecture, short lecture, some few pictures. And then we will have with you together and the online audience a short discussion about this, and then we go on with the next participant, 5-minute lecture, 10-minute discussion, and again, and we have 4 lecturers, and after this we will have a half an hour discussion with all of us, and after this we will finish this panel. What Hugo Kerez said, this I really found very, very important and interesting is one thing, if you think at conceptual design, you might think about, first of all, about creativity, but it's about understanding. And I think this is a really, really important thing to understand and understand other people, to understand the client, the sites, the history, the architects, I don't know. And I hope we will understand a lot this in this panel and in the following 3 panels. So this is it from my side. So we have 4 people standing there, and please come up to the stage now. I will introduce them in the way they will speak. So the first one will be Kerez. So I don't know how we sit there, maybe in line. So Kerez, I guess you know him. Maybe I don't talk about the people more than which is written here. So it's ETH Zurich architect. So this is one thing. We have 3 architects on the stage and 1 engineer, Joseph Schwartz. But the second will be Cecilia Puga from Santiago de Chile. Thank you for being here and participating. She also is an architect. and works in Santiago de Chile. She also teaches like every other people here as well. So she taught, I don't know, in Texas at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. So like three, also Christian and Jeanette later. So many people, or all of them are teaching. So the next is Jeanette Kuo, please, also architect. Thank you for being here as well. So she, well, there are many things. I don't know what's written here. I think this is enough. She so actually she has an office also in Zurich, and will teach, as she told me some minutes ago, starting next year in Munich at the Technical University. And last but not least, we have Joseph Schwartz, the engineer. And in this, I think, I don't know, I think maybe we sit there. We didn't do this, we didn't talk about this before. We might have, we could have done this, but I think it will work anyway. So this is it. So first of all, Christian Kerez will talk to us, and then we have, as I told you, a 5-minute lecture, 10-minute discussion. So it's your stage, Christian.
Good. I prepared some slides, and it's about the topic, right? Is the structure hidden or exposed? And basically, the argument which I would like to do with this couple of sentences and slides is that, you know, there's not good and bad. It's all the same. So first is if the structure and the space, the experience of the space is exactly the same. You know, you cannot separate one from another. It's just identical. Or you could think of a building where the structure is totally hidden. This is another project we did in Munich. And let's say each apartment was something like a spatial installation, and all the structural elements were totally hidden. So it's the opposite of the first, but for me, also kind of just a possibility. And in this, let's say, catalog, how both can relate to each other, you maybe could add that there is a structure on the inside that is also exposed on the outside. So the facade is just a prolongation of the interior space. Or you could imagine that you are within a building where the load-bearing structure is totally exposed, but you cannot understand it. Here, for example, the structure of the ceiling is the floor plan of the neighbor above, and the structure that supports the floor is hidden in the floor plan from the neighbor underneath. And of course, one could also imagine that the structure is something like the first sketch of the space, and whatever comes later doesn't hide it, but makes underlines all the structural elements, as in this example here. That's it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for this pretty short presentation. So yes, but we made some time good now, so we're on a good way. Well, of course, it's not really easy to understand this project, but as you have seen, there are some really completely different approaches. And as I told you, you have the opportunity to pose questions. Also, the online audience with the chat, but just raise your hand. So these different approaches. Is there any approach you like most, or which is, let's say, the good one, or I don't know, Christian?
Well, Basically, I think it's like a catalog, you know, and maybe if time would be longer, or if the lecture would go half an hour, you know, maybe there are 30 possible, you know, ways how the experience of the space and the load-bearing structure work together. I think it's not a, let's say, moral issue. It's not it's bad to hide the structure or it's good to expose it. What I personally like a lot, if a building can reach a certain complexity, right? And if you just expose or hide, so the first two examples I could say are a bit one-liners. It's kind of easy to achieve and maybe not that interesting. While, let's say, the last example, which is also an example of our collaboration, is much more complex, you know, because you can think of the house in terms of a client's brief, but you could think exactly in the same way of the same house of a load-bearing structure. And this, let's say, that both comes together, you know, and both becomes one entity, makes the design approach more complex. And that is not good or bad, you know, it's let's say just a personal preference of mine, or something that interests me a lot.
Yeah, and of course it depends on the project, which way you go, right?
Yes, exactly. For example, you know, the second example that is, you know, could also be considered as something bad, you know, that you make everything hidden, was also the idea that the apartment nowadays is not a, you know, an ideal typology, you know, but it's just a kind of a vast, endless variation of possibilities. So this notion of it's just an installation for a short time, you know, was feeling right with the conceptual approach.
Yeah. So, by the way, are you working always with the same engineers to create these completely different projects? That you just showed me some minutes ago, the new Dubai project,
Yeah.
with a very, well, let's say, struggling steel construction with diagonal columns. But do you have different engineers? You working with different engineers for different project types, maybe? Or?
Well, let's put it that way. You know, never change a winning team. So I like to work for a long time with the same people. And Joseph and me, we met. I think 20 years ago, right? And the longer we work together, the easier it is to understand each other. But even in the projects we do together, sometimes other engineers are involved. But I also work with other engineers, for example, Neven Kostic that worked for you. I did some projects with him.
Yep.
And for example, this project in Munich, we also did together, right? So let's say the kind of agreement, you know, what is the role that the load-bearing structure should play is something like a common decision.
Yeah. So
and it's also taken as a starting point, you know, not something that is added at the very end, but is from the first minute on the debate.
Yep. So we have one question over there. Is there any microphone for? Okay, it's coming. 1 second.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. So on your last slide, you said something like the structure is the sketch of the space. And so here is my question for the engineer next to you who worked with you. Is the space the sketch of the structure? That's a question for you,
Yeah.
Joseph.
Also ob der Raum auch die Skizze, die Struktur ist oder ob nur, also ob man das auch umgekehrt sehen kann, oder? Das, ich habe so gesagt, wie die Struktur skizziert im Raum aus.
The space is in some way defining the structure. I think that it's really vice versa. I think it's not so easy to look it from the one side. I think this is really the process of the development of the project. That is, there is always this interaction. A lot of projects we developed together, it was never clear from the very beginning if there is the space or the structure at the end, the leading element. And also in this sense, it's very difficult at the end of the process to look at the contributions of the different players. But I think it's much more a question of understanding, if you are responsible for the structure, to understand the intention of the architect and to explain in simple words the consequences of the actions you are and the decisions that have to be taken, to explain this to the architect in order to have a good discussion basis. But for me, I think both ways are in any case always involved. In one case, the one is perhaps a little bit more governing, but I think this is very important also to understand and to be then able to influence the process in a cooperation.
Maybe if I could also reply, to make it a bit more complicated. There is also one option, that, I don't know, it's the fifth or the sixth, that is, that the structure is becoming an event. And if you look here at that space, it's just, let's say, the shell of the space, but you could imagine that the columns, they are in the space and the space is totally dominated by the structure. And that is another option that we just finished a couple of days ago.
So this is the Dubai project,
Dubai.
isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Where the structure is just a spatial event, and the surrounding, the walls, the ceiling doesn't matter, The only thing that matters is how is it supported, how is it stiffened, and if you are in that space, you're totally overwhelmed by these measurements.
So I don't know if you know how the room looks like. It's a big pavilion with columns going diagonal through the whole space. So I don't know how but maybe we can talk about this later. I don't know if we have a picture of this. This would be interesting. But maybe we can care about this. So Aurelio had one question. And then another one here, and then I think we must go on.
Yeah, very often as an engineers, we like very much exposed structures. But according to my experience, the most challenging task very often is to have something in between and to have a kind of a mystery of the structure. You don't see it, but you feel it. And this is personally, I find it's a challenge, but I like also very much. For me, it's a big quality of a structure. Is it also a quality for an architect, this?
Well, I would say I live in such a quality, the apartment house on Forsterstrasse is where I live. And this is exactly as you describe it, you know, you feel that this is somehow driven by the structural design, but you cannot really understand it, you know, and it's a bit a mystery how these huge cantilevers are possible.
Yeah. Okay. So
and it's also a possibility, you know, to have a complex relationship between the definition of the space and the load-bearing structure.
So, one last question was over there. Okay, and then we have to go on. And if you still have some questions, just keep them in mind. We have another half an hour in the end, so we can discuss things going further.
Okay, hi. My question is about one of the buildings you showed. It's the building at Confluence in Lyon. There, the structure is like an event. You have the columns in the facade. But for me, it's not very clear how the structure actually works because the plates are very slender in between the columns. So it's like clear that the structural elements are very exposed and important for the architecture. But this doesn't mean that the structure is, that it's very clear how the structure works. So my question is, how important is it to you that the way the forces go in the building, and that is, if you expose a structure, that this is also readable, and how do you make these decisions?
I mean, you're somehow right. You know, I simplified a bit for this, also because of this 6 minutes. And the thing that I didn't talk about is the stiffening of the structure. There are also some cores in the building that are different, and that they do the stiffening, and they do not relate to the columns that are visible, but to the columns which are hidden in the underground of the parking. But in this sense, yes, that is also a topic of this building, that it's kind of pretends to be something very pure, very simple. But actually, if you look at it precisely, it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. But also the insulation thing in the concrete plates which are outside it's pretty complicated, as I know.
Well,
okay, it could be easier if you hadn't a problem with thermal insulation. But I think thank you very much for this first lecture. We have to go on because time is running. So Cecilia Puga will give us another lecture, and then we have another 10 minutes.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Joseph and Aurelio and all the team that is organizing this team. I will just show you two projects, and to be very precise with the time, I will read my presentation. So this is the right button, okay. So the project I will present briefly now represents a symmetric and early process of interaction and discussion between structural and architectural design. Both came out from integration between discipline, understanding it is a pairing or coupling match that resulted in new entities where they merged at unilayer proposal. The concept definition and choices for each of them were nevertheless preceded by a search of a specific quality and character of the spaces, which determine all the subsequent structure and material decisions. The project for the headquarters of the Chile Ministry of Culture, designed with Paula Velasco and Alberto Moleto, with engineer Pedro Bartolomé and Cristian Sandoval, all of them from Chile, consisted in the recovery of a 19th century ruin and the construction of a new office building. The project therefore implied a negotiation between the pre-existing and the new structure, between different time, material, and technologies. For the existing building, the proposal consisted in a small number of accurate and concealed operations that ensure the stability of the existent, restoring not only the spatial and symbolic aspect, but also the original structure performance of the building. For the structure of the new building, furthermore, we wanted a monomaterial, noisy, and dense, but porous structure, filling the blanks resulting from successive demolition and collapses of the old building, giving back to the whole its spatial and typological structure in a contemporary way, where simultaneity and coexistence of different historical time overlap. This strategy allows us not only to define the character of the new building in its relation with the pre-existing, but also to solve all the different structural requirements that the relationship between the old and the new posed, through pragmatic variation in geometry of the structural element. In this building, the structure drawn in space and found the stresses of the structure, making the management of these stresses the core of the project perception. The exposed structure create episode and rhythm which constitute the project heartbeat. From the point of view of perception, the emphasis is on the function. The project developed together with Paula Velasco, Joseph Schwartz, and Pierluigi D'Appunto in 2019 for Empresas Arauco headquarter competition, sought to achieve a clean and calm surfaces in wood and very transparent and light new type of architecture helped by the precision of prefabrication method in wood construction. We conceive a system that's solved by a single constructive component, the structure, the floor, the ceiling, and the spaces for the distribution network of the facility inside the building, expanded the range of flexibility for the organization of the plan. The supporting structure consists of a system of columns and wooden slab composed by unidirectional strip with a hollow cross-section of almost triangular shape, being supported by solid columns made of laminated wood. The slab element will be assembled using post-tension cable linked to the wooden element located at the top of the bottom of the beams. The change of direction of the beam in 90 degrees from one floor to the other allowed each other beam to be supported every 18 meters through columns and vertical cables. The reinforced concrete core are activated to resist wind and earthquake, as well as other sources of lateral load. From its synthetic nature, the structure of this proposal embodied much more than the mere solution of load transmission or the stability of the building. Rather, it brought together in its own reality the material, atmospheric, and orderly dimension of the project, while enhancing its performative capacity. At first glance, it appeared to be concealed structure. However, it is very much exposed. Everything we will have seen in the building is structure. Every surface that would have make up the space is both architecture and structure. Floors and ceiling are two sides of the same component, which is precisely designed and calculated to meet architectural and structural requirements simultaneously and as efficiently as possible. Nothing is surplus, everything is bone. Thank you. Oh, there was a last slide. I missed it just to finish.
Okay, thank you, Cecilia. So maybe we can just look at this slide. So what Aurelio just mentioned is the thing with the mystery. So you can feel when you remember the inside renderings, you can feel the structure, but you don't really understand how it works. So, and the first project, the ministry in Santiago de Chile, is completely different. So architecture is so in the courtyard. So architecture is structure. It's completely the same. So what are the reasons for these completely two different approaches?
Well, we always try to imagine which will be the character, which will be the experience we want to build in our project. So we start defining the structure by defining the ambient, the atmospheric quality of the spaces, and then we go through the different solutions possible to build that wheel. And I have to say that in my country, where these two projects were designed for, regulation are still allowing us to build with one single layer architecture and structure, which is something quite special. Still, I think things will change. But for us, it's much more easy to deal with a very intimate relation between architecture and because we don't have to add other layer if structure is enough to support all the technical and climate issue.
Yeah, so the climate issues are the reason why you don't need these additional layers, which we in Europe need everywhere, and which make things which seem to be easy, which make them complicated. When you have a look at the building from the outside, the last slide we had, it's the opposite. So when you stand outside, you seem to understand how the construction works, how the structure works. But when you're inside, you don't really. So was this intentional? So is this part of the concept?
Yeah, well, we wanted to have this very calm and continuous surface in the workspaces. We wanted a silent structure and a very light building. So the surface were absolute continuous, but we wanted also to show how this somehow to give the key to understand how this building was working. And so from the outside, we remove any kind of covering, so to expose how thin each of these three-dimensional component, structural component, were designed. And so it was a very efficient, we were with the Bloomer Lemon process in developing the way that will have been built. So it was a collaboration, very, very important, invited by Joseph to the team of discussion. So we can really, during the process of the design, to really measure how much material has to be put on this component to work in the way we wanted that. Yep. And so we wanted that to be part of the quality of the building, to communicate this lightness, this few amount of material, given that it was a wooden building, totally done.
So if you have any questions, use the chance and raise the hand. So do we have a microphone here, Ryan, down here in the middle? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Aryan Rad, postdoctoral scientist at EPFL and NCCR Digital Fabrication. Thank you for your presentation. I actually have a question for you regarding this timber building. I've been working with timber for 5 or 6 years, especially during my PhD. Regarding your later project, is this curved CLT panels is kind of inspired from what is designed by, I think, Achim Minges and Jan Knipers for the Buga Pavilion, like by changing the moisture content of timber to have these curved CLT panels? If this is so, how well you can kind of guarantee the insulation and, you know, how the moisture content of timber is controlled in that cases? Because following up what Professor Mattoni said regarding the exposed material, I think that would be a very hot topic if you're dealing with timber. Thank you.
In any case, the structure is most at the interior, and the idea was to produce it as glue lamp panels that are directly produced and glued on a deformed scaffolding or on a system. That was the idea also at the end proposed by Bluma-Lehmann to produce these elements from the very beginning as curved glue laminated panels. Yes. And as big, the dimensions are always in a way that you can transport it at the end to the site. But that was directly governed by the ideas of or by the constraints of the contractor.
Thank you.
The point for us was to produce one single element that allows us to build this beam. And I used in the presentation the word bone because of FISAC bone system. And it was the same principle translate in wood. And the three-dimensional issue allows us also to put inside all the facilities. So all the installation were occupying the core of this empty structure. And that's why we didn't need any other layer for the you know, so this two rotation and with the cables, that's why we really came out from a 18-meter dimension for the light. So it was everything was focused on that lightness of that, looking for less structure as possible in terms of perception, which is totally different than in the first project, where we wanted a very strong and dense and noisy structure to relate the two buildings, the old and the new. And also we wanted a linear structure in contrast to the very massive brick structure, the original building. So the definition starts by thinking about which is the quality of the spaces, because we know that it will be the structure that will give that quality of the spaces. I mean, not the structure and architecture for us will be one single world.
Okay, thank you. So I really would be interested in the interdisciplinary work. So when you tell us, but we should discuss this later because the time is still running, unfortunately. But it would be really interesting to have the structural view and also to have all these technical things inside. So it would be really interesting to learn more about how all these perspectives came together in this one structure. Maybe we can discuss this later. Thank you. So we will continue with Jeanette and her lecture.
All right. So I'm going to actually maybe pull back a little bit and kind of frame a little bit also maybe the relationship between the architect and the engineer. So for most of our history of construction, the question of concealing or exposing structure was never really a concern. You know, the separation of architecture and engineering, if we think about it, is actually quite a modern invention, you know, one that in the thousands of years of our built history only took place about, you know, a couple of hundred years ago. And an unfortunate result of that disciplinary split is the kind of rather oversimplified typecasting of architecture as an aesthetic discipline and engineering as a technical one. Whereas we all know that it's far more complex than that. So if we look at two of the most misunderstood protagonists, on the left you have Mies van der Rohe and on the right Antoni Gaudí, we'll realize that things are not always what they seem. That in fact, those that seem to expose are in fact concealing, and those that seem to conceal are in fact revealing. So Mies is often considered a kind of minimalist who works with structure to reveal the kind of, let's say, material honesty and the performative truth, while Gaudí is considered excessive and flamboyant, his works sort of dripping with ornamentation. But when we look closer, we realize that both are in fact toying with us. Mies, with his penchant for using structural profiles, uses them even when they are in fact not really necessary. Rather, they're deployed to create a certain visual effect, an impression of thinness or weightlessness. To him, the image of structure is just as important as the actual role of structure, using it to play with our perception. On the other hand, the flamboyance of Gaudí, which seems ornamental, is in fact a highly calibrated system with each member necessary for the overall equilibrium, a kind of delicate network of structural optimization, itself a result of many years of experimentation with form-finding models. The abstraction of form with Mies and the structural form-finding of Gaudí, we could argue, are in fact not so distinct from each other. If we understand that the relationship of architecture and engineering is always deeply entangled in a kind of mutual search for visual and spatial effect. So I'd like to argue that the role of structure in architecture is not merely one of technical problem solving, but one of spatial and organizational relationships. Even when we choose to expose the structure, it's never really about structural efficiency, nor about a kind of material honesty, but about a play with our perception. Whether an architect or as an engineer, we're interested in things that are seemingly impossible. You know, so rather than a kind of display of sort of structural might, we often go for those things that are impossibly thin or filigree. Rather than stasis and stability, we're fascinated with fragile equilibrium, the almost chaos. In fact, the most thrilling structures often don't seem structural at all. The expressive synergy between structure and space is therefore ultimately that of illusion, of hiding or playing with a certain assumed truth. So in our own work and process, our collaboration with the structural engineer is a very, very close one. From the very conceptual basis of the project until the construction, the role of structure isn't only to hold up the building, but is one that helps to define the way that we experience and use the space. So here in timber construction at the school in Rapperswil-Jona, or here in concrete construction at the University of Lausanne, structure is always part of the experience, even if sometimes they may not seem entirely structural. And sometimes the structure seems so natural that you might not even realize or notice that it's there. And that you don't really realize, in fact, the many, many hours of work between the architect, the engineer, the steel contractor, and all the other trades that come into play in these types of conversations the negotiations that happen and the brainstorming that happens in order for the joints to look clean, to look like it actually was there to begin with. So like here with the steel construction at the Archaeological Center at Basel-Land, where we just finished the first phase, and the exposed structure actually helps to define a kind of structural or kind of organizational logic for inhabitation, but also a concept for the kind of longevity and the evolution of the use. And here in the newest project that we just won in Basel, a hybrid timber and concrete structure in a competition for lab building. In each of these cases, the structure really is very much a part of the experience of the building, and somehow you can't really disentangle structure and the kind of engineering and the architecture, the structure and the design. So in each case, these were conscious choices. These were conscious choices to serve multiple purposes. And for us, in the end, maybe just to conclude, is that the collaboration with the engineer, in some ways, you could say is like a jazz set. Sure, very often we as architects, because it's a building, we take the lead, since we're also coordinating all the other consultants, all the people that come to the table for this conversation. We keep the kind of overall vision of the project, but it really is also a jam session, right? We're brainstorming, we're throwing ideas to each other, and we're kind of rethinking each in our own disciplines, but trying to make a better whole. It's never really about the most efficient or the most pure solution, nor is it about the most flamboyant solution. Exposing or concealing is also always part of that game, but it's almost always about a conceptual economy of means, a way in which the architectural and the structural ideas align to produce a holistic solution. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jeanette. So it would have been interesting if you put Mies van der Rohe and Gaudi in one room and they had to design a building together. So what do you think? What does this look like, or what would this look like?
Well, I think it's funny because I think if you were to ask me where I would position myself on that spectrum, probably I would land somewhere in that middle. So I think that it's this was referenced in a way with what Cecilia and also what Christian was saying before, is that to a certain degree, the ambiguity sometimes is what makes it interesting. And the fact that, both of these people we normally think as being very, very different, from opposing camps of how they would design, are all in some ways trying to use structure as a way of expressing a relationship to space, but in ways that maybe are not always what we think is there. So I think that in some ways, it's very easy to sort of oversimplify the roles, and I think what's interesting really is that these types of collaborations, when it's a true collaboration, it's never really about one or the other, but about a kind of strange ambiguity.
Yeah. So what do you think? How does the co-working between Mies and his engineer with, I don't know, Seagram building, how does this? How was the process? What do you think? All of you.
Actually, I don't know.
We don't know, but was it Mies who said, okay, I want to do the building so, and then do the calculation, please, or did they have a real conversation? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I do think that I think that there probably was a kind of real conversation in terms of what that could mean. I mean, I do think that there is some role that mullion that I was talking about, the kind of I-beam that's on the front,
outside, is
playing on a structural level. You could argue that it probably is helping to stiffen the curtain wall to play a role in terms of the kind of overall. But you can also solve that very differently. And I think that that's the thing that sometimes is misunderstood, is that people think that there's only one way to solve the problem, but in fact, it's always a choice, right? And yes, some choices are maybe more let's say, pragmatic than others, and others are more flamboyant. But I think it's in making that choice that the let's say the kind of collaboration of the architecture comes about.
Yeah, so that's what Joseph will mention later, so that you always have a choice to do something or to not do something. So there's no one? No, oh, two. Okay, so okay, we start here.
Thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask how the choice of material influences the decision whether you conceal or you open a structure. Like whether you choose a timber as construction material or concrete or steel.
So the choice of material, you know, really, like it was a kind of a coincidence, in fact, that all of our projects and the ones that we've built so far have all been in a different, let's say, structural material. Partly was conscious because I think we just wanted to experiment with different ways of working, but also I think, you know, each project has its own constraints and has its own conditions that we have to respond to. And in each case, I think the choice of structure was also a very, very deliberate one. In these, you know, 4 specific cases, we used timber, for example, in the school one, because we had to stack 2 floors of classrooms on top of a gym. And so we had to span actually quite a lot. We had to make sure that the load on top was quite light. And so we substituted timber for the concrete that normally, you know, that we would have had there. In the steel construction for Augusta Raurica, that was actually a kind of an issue with the fact that we were building on the ruins, but also with the fact that it was supposed to be a kind of demountable system. You know, that this building as a concept is that it could be, on the one hand, infinitely extendable, but on the other hand, could one day be completely demounted so they can dig underneath for the ruins, and therefore the whole thing could be recycled. So, you know, those are just some of the examples. Of course, there's other reasons also in terms of why we chose the materials on the other ones, but I think, you know, in a nutshell, they're usually always responding to criteria that was part of the project brief.
Mm-hmm. So we do another question here and then continue to have, in the end, a big discussion. But we first want to have, for the big discussion, the lecture of Joseph then. So, okay.
Yeah, I'm Bill Baker from SOM Chicago. And what I'd be interested to hear you discuss is this room, where all you see is structure and architecture, and you can't separate them, including this implied ceiling above us, which is pure structure and pure architecture, where you see it, and then the 5 people on the stage. You are all formed by structure, but we do not see your structure. Your bones are inside you, and it's implied in your geometry of your shape, which is, for me, somewhat the comparison between Mies, where the structure is inside the skin, and Gaudi, where it's like an exoskeleton, where it's expressed. So I'd be interested in discussing this implied structure of the high-rise versus the exoskeleton of, say, a low-rise or Gaudi-like building.
Thank you.
So, I don't know if that was a general question for everyone, or if I should.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you said that you know, the structure of us is our bones, and how are the bones expressed on the outside? And I think that is very particular in both cases. In the case of Mies and also Gaudi, but in a different way. Because let's say the building of Mies is like a grid, like a endless grid that is at a certain moment kind of transformed into a skin. And I think in Gaudi, you also have these very strong structural elements, but it's like they are kind of peeled off, or they become a skin, and they transform in a very different way. But when you made this presentation, I was also thinking, actually, this is the main difference between the two. It's not that one worked with round shapes and the other with orthogonal ones, but what is the relationship between the skin and the bone? What is the relationship between, let's say, the building as an entity that has borderlines and the interior structure that could be always also thought as something endless? Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure if this corresponds to your question.
No, I mean, I think that just to kind of build on that a little bit, though, I think that what's interesting also is with Mies, you know, he makes that effort also to have the structure kind of come to the outside, or at least to appear like structure coming to the outside, and that there follows a certain logic that you would, you know, to the eyes of a layman, appear like it was structural. So I think that this is why, for me, it was actually very interesting, is it's a question of what that image is, you know, the image of structure, what we perceive as structure or structural, and how we kind of relate to that. Because I think in the case of Gaudi, he tries to make every effort, in fact, to deconstruct that image. So you know, what we conventionally would understand as structure, he sort of, you know, plays with us on that level. And I think, you know, this is what's also kind of interesting with them, is that they have very different starting points, but the ways in which they manipulate that, therefore, changes our understanding. And I think that's maybe, you know, also the kind of ambitions that usually with these types of projects, what gets interesting with the ambiguity is the fact that they take us away from what we typically would associate with that image of structure.
Yeah. So I'm sorry to be the bad guy, but I think we should listen now the last lecture and then go into a deep discussion. So thank you for the questions. So it's Joseph to continue. Joseph Schwartz. Sure of these chairs.
Good. Looking a little bit from the point of the civil engineer, what structural design could be, I would make the code that it's an initial point of discussion for the question of physical necessity and creative freedom. If you are looking at these three bridges, we have three arch bridges, three simple arch bridges, and these bridges are strongly motivated by boundary conditions. The first one by the landscape, by the material they found there, not a lot of calculation, a lot of intuition, very in correspondence with the landscape. Then we see the second bridge. It was one of the first bridges in reinforced concrete. There, it's really demonstration of the potential of this material. This bridge seems really to be spanned, to be tensioned in a way at the maximum exactly before that she cracks and collapses. It's working in compression, but nevertheless, we have this feeling, and this is clearly a demonstration of the potential of this material, but nevertheless very strongly informed by the stone bridge in the sense of the arch. Then the third bridge of Carlos Campi, reinterpretation of the classical bridges in Venice with totally different materials, with totally different tectonics, three ways of designing a bridge. And it's clear that in this case, if you're looking at these three bridges, that structural design, as mentioned before, has to do a lot with decisions, has to do a lot with an attitude. And this is what structural design is, and not the other way around, a supporting structure, bearing capacity, and so on. And in this sense, it's not possible by calculation, by any analytical methods to find out which system makes sense or which system doesn't make sense in a given situation. Nevertheless, both, all the three and all arch bridges are nevertheless under the conditions of this physical necessity, on the one hand, more looking at the work of the civil engineer, and the creative freedom, on the other hand, looking at the way of working of the architect. And from our point of view, we have these very important elements we also mentioned several times this morning. On the one hand, the tectonics of load bearing, on the other hand, the tectonics of joining, and then the architectural concepts. And all these different bridges are strongly driven by these different aspects, and this the interaction of these three aspects that are at the end the spirit of structural design. This is clearly not only the case for bridges, but it's exactly the same for buildings. Also there we have the material, we have the flow of forces, we have the architectural concept, and it's the interaction of these three elements that at the end defines, in our sense, structural design. To perhaps a little bit illustrate this, we see here a lot of different models that were developed during the developing process of the school building of Leutschenbach, physical necessity. All these different models, these different systems are in accordance with physical necessity, but the creative freedom is clearly also visible here, and also the intention to build this stacking and to have this differentiation between public and more private spaces is in all these different cases present, but it's a totally different expression of the structure. That means at the end, looking from the side of the civil engineer, it's clearly not possible by mathematical optimization to find out which structure is perhaps more reasonable than another one. That means experience and also intuition plays a very important role. And in this sense, I like very much this quote of Eugène Freycinet, coming back to intuition. There exists, to my mind, only two sources of information: direct perception of the facts and the intuition through which I perceive the expression and the synthesis of all the experience accumulated throughout life. Of course, intuition must be controlled by experience. However, when it happens to contradict the result of calculation, I have the calculation checked, and my colleagues confirm that when all is said and done, it is the calculation that is always wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for this last lecture. So it's not always me putting the first question, so you could also do this. Okay, we start here.
Joseph, you showed some pictures of structures that have, especially the 5 bridges along the top, that have a very clear and strong visual expression of the flow of forces. And as an engineer, my emotional response to these structures is intimately linked to the fact that I can understand the flow of forces. I have a body of engineering knowledge to draw on, and that informs my emotional response. I think so anyway. And I wanted to know, what are your ideas on how lay people respond to the visual expression of the flow of forces, given that they do not have this body of knowledge to draw on?
Mm.
Yes, it comes back also back to a question that was asked in the very beginning. This way of looking at the internal forces on different levels, or looking on hiding or exposing on different levels, also for people who understand much more about structures. So you can hide a structure by only hiding it, by cladding it, but you can also hiding it by bringing it in relation to the spaces that it's not on the first view understandable. Now, for people who are not trained or not educated in structural design, at the end, it's only the intuition that allows them to understand how such a bridge is working. When I was a child, we always we had a bridge that was a bridge deck with an arch, and very simple, and the platform was hanging on the arch. And I could, as a child, never understand why they put this additional load of the arch over the deck. For me, it was not so easy understandable, this interaction. And this shows a little bit, surely, that it's not so easy for people that are not trained to really understand, but there are nevertheless effects. For instance, Christian mentioned it for the house in Forsterstrasse. When you have big cantileverings, it seems for a lot of people from the very beginning very dangerous to walk under these cantilevering elements. This is something that we have in our intuition. If you're then going to the cable, it's easy to understand because it's also an element we often use. The arch is already a little bit more difficult, and if it comes to more yes, to more refined structures, then it's an interesting question how it really is the interaction between the people and the structure. I don't know.
Yeah. So and if you think at the arch, some people don't even understand why it works if you just put it like here. This is, if you explain this to people, they okay, that's like an arch works. So you just have to hide. You have to verhindern. Yeah, you have to prevent that it goes like this.
But it's very easy with simple models, also in teaching, to bring these main load-bearing effects near to the understanding of people.
Yeah. So another question right behind.
Yes, coming back to the apparent arch in Wildeck.
So maybe it would be interesting for all of you just to say your name and say what profession you have.
Martin Hobeck, structure engineer.
Okay.
Even though now working geotechnics, I would challenge your view that the arch in Wildeck is an arch. It's not an arch. It's two cantilevers joining. If we look at them and how massive they are at the abutments and how thin it is in the crown, so it's really two cantilevers, like free cantilevering construction methods. It's not working as an arch, I would presume. And you could tell that only by looking at the reinforcement sketches. If you have more reinforcement on top, then you really see it's two cantilevers, not an arch.
Interesting point. What do you think?
Yes, this is perhaps an egg and chicken discussion. At the end, it's clear that it's a question of the boundary conditions of the system And nevertheless, there is also an arch action at the end. It's a question of geometry and a question of the internal construction of the building and the way it works. And this is a decision that can taken by the design. Now we can, this is also a very important aspect. We can tell to the structures how they should work. And then at the end, you can build this very slender reinforced bridge by cutting the walls at the abutments, and then it's clear how it works. You can also cut the bridge in the middle, and then you have two cantilevers, and in reality you will always have something in between, and we as designers can inform the structure how it has to work. And I think this is also a very important point that we don't use enough. We don't make enough use of this.
So we have three questions. It would be the best that we pose the questions first that relates directly to this discussion now. So Aurelio?
Yeah. Well, the remark by Martin is very interesting. I suspect that this remark is very much influenced by the experience of the last 50, 60 years when we use a lot of reinforcement. But in fact, the bridge by Joseph Monnier was almost without any reinforcement, which means that it was really an arch, and it shows really very nicely. We have built a lot of cantilevers in the last decades, which means that if you see something like this, you have the impression it is a cantilever, but it was an arch. And related to, I had another question to Joseph. Well, we have discussed this many times, but perhaps it's interesting to share this thought. Very often, we verify an intuition with a calculation, or we verify a calculation with intuition. Very often, many engineers work like this, in fact. And the question is, what happens when the intuition and the calculation doesn't match? We know, all of us had this experience. You do a calculation, it works, and you feel that something is not correct, or the opposite. By intuition it works, and you do the calculation, it doesn't work. What happens in this case?
Yeah, there are surely the two cases. There are the cases where, in any case, we are wrong with the intuition, and calculation can help to find out where the mistake is. But very often it's the other way around. And we see this in finite element calculations daily, and that there are very strange results, and then at the end it's totally against intuition, and then we see that something is wrong with the information of the program, or with the boundary conditions, or whatever. And I think it's probably this this contradiction between intuition and calculation that helps us a lot to avoid big accidents. Because on the one hand, it's waking up in the night and reflecting things, but on the other hand, it's also this effect that brings us further and helps us to understand better. And this is also a question of experience. Yes, but on the other hand, if you are young, perhaps you have much more courage, and if you have a lot of experience, you see much more problems and critical moments everywhere. That means experience has also two sides of the medal.
So
in this context,
and then.
So thank you very much for your presentations. Many things, good projects, different projects in different places. You are architects who are very close to structural engineers. And this is very good for us. As I said in my presentation, it is very interesting to work with the architects. But I have a general question, which is the real position of the structural engineers in the relation with the architects. Let me give you some examples. Gaudí was an isolated person. He was not asking anyone. Mies van der Rohe was completely different. Even Fisac was had very good and close relationships with some engineers, your father, for example. And but if you see the period of in which piano, Richard Rogers and Norman Foster were doing many interesting things, there was behind Peter Rice. And my question is, Peter Rice, which was the influence in the architecture of Peter Rice? You were talking about fidelity, and they were very close to him. They never abandoned him. Unfortunately, he died very young. I had not the opportunity to ask him this question. But I think in Torrojas, for example, Torroja from Spain, he was working with the architects many times in many competitions. And my question is, which was the real implication? He understood, because you have to understand the problem, but how far he was able to go to participate in the design. Because in some cases, you make possible other ideas. In some other cases, you can help and you can be more integrated, but you are not going further than that. But in some cases, I imagine that Peter Rice, for example, played another role. I would like to
maybe we should mix a little bit now. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm
Thank you, Hugo.
Maybe just to respond to that question, I think it's a really interesting and very pertinent one. And actually, what's interesting about that relationship, I think we've gone through sort of historical moments and shifts in terms of what that relationship means between the architect and the engineer. I think the three architects that you brought up was of a very specific period of this kind of, euphoria of the high-tech moment, right? Really the celebration of technology, the celebration of the image of technology. And I think in that sense, the engineer was very much part of that mix, because that language of what they wanted to express, Rogers, piano, all of these things was about the expression of that as a language. I think that we've entered a period now, and partly I think because of a lot of the different complexities that we're dealing with, that's not just on a kind of technical performance level, but really about us as a society, and the kind of humanist aspects of that. The fact that we're designing spaces, I think also this question earlier about, how does the layman perceive the structural forces? Is that important or not? Or like, how do we, I think at the end of the day, we're designing essentially for people and for the kind of longevity of what this means. And so I think that part of that conversation has pivoted a little bit over to maybe a more fuller integration of what, it's not just a structural engineer that's on the table with the architect. Now we have 10 other, engineers, let's say, that might be on that same table, because we're dealing with technical solutions also on the level of sustainability, on the level of all the kind of different systems that come into the building. And I think that complexity has led us to almost a kind of stepping back of seeing who's leading this discussion, who's bringing it together as this Gesamtkunstwerk in a way, right? And I think that in that sense, it's not a dialogue of two people, it's actually conversation of many. And I think that led us to a search which is much more about the importance of a space, of how you understand and use that space and what that actually means for the kind of sustainable future of us as a society.
Thank you. So there was one more question here.
Thank you. My name is Martino Pedrozzi, and my question is the following. When I saw the two pictures of Mies and Gaudí, and your explanations afterwards, this came in my mind. If ambiguity is a goal, or if it is an unavoidable condition.
My colleagues might answer this differently. I don't want to take over the entire time, but I'll keep it short. I think that it's definitely avoidable. We know of projects that, yes, I think that it's
a goal.
So it is a goal. It is a goal. I think it's a goal in the sense of people that are interested in that as a goal. But
Say precisely the opposite, you know. No, you know, ambiguity is an ideal in postmodernism, and it means that you can read a work in different layers, in different meanings, you know. And this is something I kind of highly respect, and it's also somehow a fantasy, right, or an ideal which is which you maybe can only approach. But the ideal that interests me much more is, you know, when things become evident, when something is can be very clearly identified as a specific, let's say, element in architecture. And of course, this is to a certain extent illusion, you know, or and then I think it is could be regarded as an architectural element, could be regarded as a structural element, but it's both at the same time, you know, and not one reading of it is different than the other. This is a quite abstract difference, and it's not a difference of right and wrong, but it's maybe more a difference of a, I don't know what I do with this chair.
We may should talk about this structure. Maybe the next panel can do the discussion about.
No, it's me that is wrong. You know, it's not the chair. Anyway, well, I think this sounds very, you know, similar, but it is not, right? It's a difference in understanding and how you can look at something and how you can read something or understand something.
Yeah, so now I'm thinking about, Josef, you talked about physical necessity and creative freedom. And when it comes to the physical necessity, I don't know if this is true. Most of people, maybe not in this room, but outside these rooms, most people think about an engineer, and the creative freedom is somehow located with an architect, at an architect. So why is this like this, and what are the consequences?
Yeah, I think it's like this due to development in history of the last 200 years, when the methods of calculation were more and more refined, and people really believed in this, and civil engineering was looked as an exact science in contradiction to architecture. But if you are speaking today about conceptual design, then it's clear that also this physical necessity is part of a big freedom of solutions, and clearly there are random conditions, there are boundary conditions given by physics, but also in architecture, this liberty is in some way restricted, and there are also boundary conditions. And in this sense, if we are really speaking about structural design, both elements are coming very close together. And the proof is that by calculation is not a tool to make conceptual design, but is only a proof at the a tool to at the very end of the process make some proofs that are also necessary, but at the very beginning, and this working together from the very beginning, I think that is the most important part. And in this moment, freedom is on both sides very high, and it's in this sense for me very similar.
Yes, but if you look at a percentage of projects which are known from architects and from engineers, I think the percentage of creative projects from engineers would be much more less than the one at the architectural side, even though the freedoms are equal. Really?
Yeah, I think there's plenty of engineers that are really creative. It's just that
Yes.
there's also plenty of architects. Sorry,
you're right.
Yeah. You know, I mean, we have buildings out there that you're like, well, who actually designed that as an architect?
Yeah,
but,
you're right.
So I don't think I think it's an oversimplification, and it's because of the image that we have of these two professions that we've come to understand it that way.
Yep.
I would say that it will depend on if you assume the project as a research moment in terms of architecture or engineering. And I think that it's somehow the way I can answer your question, because normally many times we don't work in that field. We are not researching doing a project. Sometimes we really took the tools we have already in our case of tools, you know, and that I think in that moment architects work much more with intuition. So we take decision about the structure without doing all the calculation, of course, and then the engineer comes to the team somehow to reveal if there are problems in there. But when the work is a research team, like in the wooden competition, we were supposed to propose a new kind of structure for wooden high-rise building. So that was a technological and architectonic challenge. And so from the very beginning, we were researching. It was not certitude in the where we will have finished. So in that moment, in that process, the dependence between engineering and architecture is absolute. There is an absolute need from one to the other. And in our experience working with Joseph and his team and Pierluigi and Bloomer Lemon, that was the experience. We needed each other. So the concept came out from the relation and interaction and also negotiation between all the team. But I think that it's a privilege. It's not the experience we have every time in the project. Sometimes because of the complexity, or maybe because we don't take it in that way, we are not in the field of innovation, in the field of research, in the field of taking risk, and maybe to have the opportunity to make some kind of apportation, you know, to the field of knowledge or experience for architect or engineering. I think that is a very, very privileged moment in our career as architects.
Yep.
In my case, at please.
So now we have Joseph once more, and then Pierluigi has a question from the online audience. And then I think we should, you can hear the noise over there, and then we should terminate. So Joseph.
Yes, we are convinced that this need for cooperation is always given, and there is not this big difference if it's a research project or if it's not, let's say, an experimental research project, because every building in some way that has to be developed is a prototype. And from the moment it's a prototype, I think some kind or some level of research is needed. And in this sense, it's better to work together from the very first day. But I think it's much more a question of the level of interaction and of cooperation. That's very important. Starting at the very beginning, and then the quality of discussion, the quality of trying to understand the other part, and also the challenge to increase the quality of the project and developing process by bringing it always on a higher level. And there I see very big differences by working with together with different architects. Even if you are starting from the very beginning, often the possibility of an interaction as a civil engineer is much smaller with colleagues in architects than with other ones who are really interested in using this structure from the very beginning, understanding and bringing space and structure together, and interested in this very nice process. And for other ones, there may be the same very interesting discussions on details or on a totally different level. And there I see really a spectrum of different levels of working together, and this has to do with the attitude of the team players, from my point of view.
Yeah, thank you again. So Pierluigi, one more time with a question.
Actually, very much connected to what you just said, Joseph. Okay. There is a nice question from the audience online. So I would like to remember there is also an audience online. We have more than 50 people watching us now. So the question is actually addressed to Joseph Schwartz and Christian Kerez, but I think we can extend it to everyone in the stage. Victoria Maleva is asking, when does the collaboration between the architect and the structural engineer begin for you? What does, in this case, Kerez, bring to a first meeting for a project? A verbally expressed idea about a space, a sketch, or a more developed drawing layout?
Yeah. Well, you know,
okay.
I have to admit, I have very heavy bones. I would say it starts on a much earlier stage, you know, and that is, do you have the same interests, you know, do you have the same expectations of a design process? And you could say, well, a design process is an adventure, you know, and it sounds very, you know, everybody would love an adventure, right? But it also means you don't know what comes out at the end. This means it's a certain risk, you know, and that moment it turns, you know, it's maybe putting you in uncomfortable situations. Are you then still interested in, you know, in the experience of an adventure? And we are also talking about research, and it also sounds so positive, you know, but research maybe doesn't lead to anything. That's the risk of it, you know. If it's a true research, you cannot start with saying, well, it's clear we will achieve that, and no matter what, you know. And this openness, does it truly exist, or is it just you know, that we feel comfortable with addressing just the positive side of it, you know, and that is maybe a way of looking at the collaboration in a different way, you know, more that it's more a conspiracy, or that, as you say in German, you steal horses together. And a person that is very important besides the engineer and the architect is also the client. And in the first meeting that I have with private clients, I explain them that my idea of a design process is that of an intellectual adventure. And I lose already in this first meeting 4 out of 5 clients, you know, because they are definitely not looking for that you know, Joseph and me would go for an adventure trip with their private money. And I think that is very important, you know, to shift also the coin, you know, and I would say it's also easy to start, right? And then you see a concept, and of course that's possible. Everything is possible, but then to go really to the end, you know, that is the challenge, or that is also what I appreciate the most in a collaboration. And this attitude, you know, is it really there? And I would say most architects are lazy, you know, and most engineers are lazy and comfortable. And this means they actually are looking for a shelter, or looking for a comfort zone, or they want to have also an easy life. And I would say if we turn it once again around, we are interested in an extremely difficult, complicated life, full of risks, full of things which are unclear. And I just wanted to, you know,
no, that's
turn a bit this, oh, it starts so nice, and together we have a, we sketch together and make models together. I think what is the most common starting point is really this attitude, you know, are you ready for paying the price, what it means in the end?
Okay, so I'm really grateful for this picture of the adventure, and thank you very much.